Welcome back, Social 10. We're looking at human rights today in our lesson number 21. And in lesson 21, the first thing we need to do really is define human rights. And although we're about to watch a 9-minute video, and they're going to struggle with defining it, some of the most insightful things that these people say in the video is, what are human rights? And you can watch for this in a minute. They say things like, those are rights that humans have, right? And that's kind of like a grade 7 response, right? What are human rights? Oh, I got this. They're rights that humans have, but even in its ignorance, even in its simplicity, the answer is there. That what are human rights? They're things that you're entitled to based upon the fact that you're human. These are things that you're naturally entitled to. That you don't need to qualify for them. A human right isn't something that, oh, you have blonde hair, or you have not blonde hair, or you have green eyes or blue eyes, and therefore you have different rights. No, human rights by definition are meant to be something that is natural, and often we use the word inalienable, meaning that they can't be taken away. So we will watch a video that shows some people in New York City they're being interviewed on the street, what are human rights, and they're going to stumble through it. And I do think that even in the simplest answer, rights that humans have, there is a glimmer of clarity. That these are things that, because we're human, they're natural to us. Within that video, we're also going to see the evolution of human rights. We're going to see some milestone moments. So you're going to be able to create a bit of a timeline where you'll be able to announce that, well, here's an event, and because of that, we actually have more human rights than we did after or before that event. So I want you to keep note of some of these moments in history where mankind was able to wrestle more human rights away from what had been, very authoritarian governments. When we say identify specific human rights, you definitely studied the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in grade 9 social studies. So that's just last year. So you should be able to right now list some human rights. Let's see how many you can list. So let's not just make a list and make it random. Let's try to list. Let's begin with what you think are the most important. So what would you say that if you take away this one right, you would find yourself in a dystopia, a flawed society, a poisonous society, a place that you wouldn't want to live? What's the most important rights to you? Yes?
The right for freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Okay, so let's think about that one for a second. And I got lots of hands up, and we'll get to you guys. Freedom of speech. So, again, you'll study the French Revolution next year. And when we study the French Revolution, we'll see that when they declare their new French state and they create a Declaration of the Rights of Man, one of the key, and many would say the most important right, was the freedom of speech. Because it was through the freedom of speech that they could create change, that they could communicate how they wanted their government to be organized. Freedom of speech is how we share our ideas. That if you take away the freedom of speech, then our lives become quite limited. And we become very controlled. So many people would agree, freedom of speech is the most important right. We do have a quote that's associated with someone called Voltaire. And often, at times of turmoil, like we've been seeing in the world, recently, I think of Voltaire's quote. So Voltaire was a philosopher that actually helped inspire the French Revolution. He's worshipped during the French Revolution. And he's remembered for saying, I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say. So he's saying freedom of speech is paramount, But he's even taking it to the next level. He's saying, even if I disagree with what you're saying, I'd rather die than you be silenced. We're living in an America today where the President of the United States has been silenced by social media. He's been impeached by the House of Representatives. There's a trial in the House of Senate to see where that impeachment will lead. We have people in America that are being censored. We have people in Canada being censored. And Voltaire would say, even if I see you on the opposite of an argument, I don't want you silenced. I'd rather die to defend your right to express your emotions freely. And I just think of, how few times we actually see people that passionate about the freedom of speech. People usually get angry when somebody disagrees with them. And they're like, man, why can you say that? How do you say that? You need to be quiet. You can't say that. And it's like, no, you should be celebrating the fact that they do say that. That you have enough tolerance that people can express different opinions. So freedom of speech is definitely one of those key moments. Later today, I want you to think about, though, as vital as it is, when is it okay to silence people? So even though we're saying it could be the most important right, when is it okay to take it away? So I'm going to challenge you with that later in the class. What's another right that we see? Yes, sir. So the right to own property, right? So if you take away the right to own property, would Mr. McBride be at work today? Other than the food that I consume, if I can have no lasting property, there's a lot less wealth that I need to create. So you take away the right to own property, you take away a lot of the motivation for people to work. Yes?
In the words of Thomas Jefferson, the freedom to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So the freedom, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, I did like that part, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you have all of these other rights, but someone takes away your right to life, well, Voltaire aside, most people would say they'd rather be alive than to give up the right to freedom of speech. If I had to choose between being silenced or being executed, I'll shut my mouth. I'm not Voltaire. Voltaire believed in the freedom of speech more than I do. Maybe I'm too mortal of a man. I have too much invested in my life. But definitely the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Now, the pursuit of happiness may return back to John Stuart Mill that we talked about earlier. Your pursuit of happiness should be absolute as long as it doesn't interfere with my pursuit of happiness. Any other rights that you guys are aware of? Yes? The freedom of protest. And in the United States, they have the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. So Second Amendment, very famous, that's the right to bear arms. First Amendment is freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly and petition, the freedom of the press, and the freedom to worship. And they listed those first because those are the fundamental rights. That those are the key rights. This is the First Amendment. That these are the bedrocks of American life. That you take away any of those, and you no longer have democracy. America! Yeah. Any other key rights that you guys are aware of? Yes?
This one's more opinion, but I believe the freedom to healthcare.
Yeah, so, and again, that is an opinion, but the right to have health care. In Canada, universal health care is like a birthright. We're born as Canadian citizens with access to public health care. Public health care that you are actually a customer of before you're born. As your mom goes in for prenatal stuff, there's one of those scan things that happens. Maybe there's some nutrition that's provided to your mom, some prenatal vitamins. That's as much as I can think of at the top of my head, but you are a customer of the Canadian healthcare system even before birth. And some would say that that's a birthright as being a tax-paying Canadian, that the government has created this part of the contract with us. Yes, sir? Yeah, the right to choice in general, but choices of lots of things, right? Including occupational, relationship choices, things like that. Religious choice. So the right to, plurality and free thought. Any other rights that you're aware of? Yes.
Freedom of sexuality, whether that be actually having sex or your sexual orientation.
So sex the act or sex the identification. So you have sexual rights, and sexual rights have evolved in the last years and decades. You know, what is a gender has changed, you know, much within your lifetime. That when you were born, there were less identifiable genders than there are now. So that's definitely a classification of rights that is still evolving. Yes? Yeah, so, and with gender probably inspired you to think of that, right? The right to choose your own identity. And that could include occupational choices and religious choices, but also gender choices.
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of religion. So let's continue on. So that's a basic introduction into the definition of human rights. We're going to watch a video in a moment that will show you the evolution of human rights. We're also, though, trying to think of, you know, what are some significant ones? And with these human rights today, I want you to think about, if we take that right away, why would life become less? So the culminating activity that you'll be doing later in class is you're going to be selecting one of these rights, and you're going to explain to me why taking it away would lessen your life. You know, why is that right such a threshold right that is critical to a good life? But then I want you to think critically, and using the same right, I want you to say, but these are times when it must be taken away. Yes, sir?
So, if you're, like, let's say there is no such thing as the freedom to speak, but does that just mean that you're not allowed to speak at all, or?
Freedom of speech is usually used to describe the freedom to question others. So freedom of speech is usually described as freedom to oppose the government, freedom to oppose those in authority. So you're still allowed to talk. You're like, hey, look, it's a bird. But you're not allowed to say it's a bird if the government has taught everybody that that's actually a dog, a flying dog. A flying dog that lays eggs.
I mean, like, if you don't have the right, does that automatically mean that, like, how do I word this? Either you're not allowed to do it?
If you don't have the right, then it becomes illegal to do it. So I might not have the right to make meth, but I might still make meth, right?
So that's what you're doing in your
So I might not have the right to do that, but I still might be violating the legal code, and I might be doing something that is unlawful. But then if I'm caught, there'll be repercussions in the judicial system. I don't know why meth is always a good example, right? We're also going to look at women's rights today. In Social 30, we'll talk about the waves of feminism, and I want to kind of get that conversation started today. So, next part, we're going to watch a video. The video is going to define human rights for you a little bit more, and it's going to give you a timeline of the evolution of human rights. During the video, take note of the definition. During the video, take note of the key milestone moments. At the end of the video, I'm going to say, what are some milestone moments that because of this moment, we redefined human rights or we ended up getting more human rights? And I want your hands to come up and say, Magna Carta or French Revolution, and then we can talk about those milestone moments. So in order to understand the significance of human rights, we need to understand the centuries-long evolution of them and the painful struggle it's been to achieve them. And yes, this guy looks a little like a pirate.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question. Human rights. Wow.
What shall I use it?
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right, I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have.
this is a very large debate.
Mezcla su mindset.
Que tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes
saprei, andare complicatissima.
We just take it for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live, equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. He documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop that, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded. But the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France, everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers, free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent, who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
If I can get you the lights, please. So we have lots to talk about. First thing I'd like to point out is this is a non-governmental organization that is trying to promote human rights. So you always want to know, what is the agenda, what is the perspective of the source that you're consulting. And this is a NGO that is meaning to promote human rights, and they see the UN as a potential vehicle to do that. So let's begin with human rights, and the most basic question, what are human rights? Anything that you ended up gleaning from the video that you could add to our understanding? What are human rights? Did you get anything in addition to what we've talked about? Yes, sir.
They are our everyday choices that have been given to us because we are simply human.
Okay, so everyday choices that have been given to us simply because we are human by birth, right? These are the choices we have because we're human.
All right, every human is entitled to have at birth no matter their choices later on in life.
Yeah, and these are rights that we have based on our birth, regardless of our choices after life. So that makes it sound pretty absolute, right? So in a moment, we're going to do an exercise where we try to figure out the reasonable limits of government, but based upon those two descriptions, they sound fairly absolute.
It's our base guidelines that are choices reflect upon.
Yeah, so in combination, what they've said, excellent summary of what human rights are. Now, the next part of the video really focuses on what are some milestones in the history of human rights. Now, I want you to understand the timeline so that we can understand the significance. Before we take a human right away, we need to know the significance of the history of trying to gain that human right, right? Like how long we struggled to get it. So, what are some milestones that they mentioned in terms of getting human rights? Yes?
The Cyrus Cylinder.
Okay, so Cyrus Cylinder. What's so important about that?
It was one of the first declarations of human rights, according to the video.
So according to the video, and the video is missing some events. According to the video, it's a declaration of human rights. They write them down. Remember when we studied the Neolithic Revolution and we said people are coming from all over, different tribes, different cultures, different adherence to different norms, right? And they come together in a new community, and it's like, well, what is lawful? What is the acceptable behavior? Cyrus said, let me write this stuff down. I'm going to write it down so we know what we should be up to. Yes?
World War II basically showed what happens if you don't follow the guidelines.
Okay, so the video also highlights moments when human rights begin to be lost and the negative part of that. Yeah.
England was one of the first places where a person in absolute power recognized human rights as a basic fundamental of society.
So next year in Social 20, you're going to study a term called absolutism. Absolutism is when the monarchy has the authority to rule because of the divine right of God, right? God made you the king or the queen, and therefore what you do is God's will, and you cannot question God, so you cannot question the king or queen. Because of the Magna Carta, signed in 1215, powers of the monarchy in England began to be limited.
Gandhi showed that everyone around the world deserved rights and not just the people of Europe.
Yeah, so before Gandhi, a lot of people assumed that human rights were just for Europeans. But Gandhi spread the concept of human rights to the colonies, to the non-Europeanized pockets of populations around the world, to show that these are truly universal. Yes? Yeah, so Eleanor Roosevelt, no UN declaration in 48. So she was the driving force behind the UN declaration that is the standard for the planet today.
Two people the video did not cover were Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, who went around the world giving healthcare to troops all over the world.
Yeah, so there's actions of lots of people. Unfortunately, the video is nine and a half minutes long, so they left so many things out, so many critical things. Rosa Parks and the protests in Montgomery, Alabama. We have the works of people like Florence Nightingale going around the world bringing medicine and healthcare to people that didn't have that allotted to them. Next up, the video says we have human rights declared today, but in many circumstances they're just words on a page. If your topic sentence in a paragraph was, human rights in 2021 are often just words on a page, how do you describe that? How do you defend that? What's your evidence? What's your evidence that there's places in the world where human rights, they might say, well, you have the right to blank be blank, but in fact you don't have the right to blank be blank. So give me some examples of the blank be blank, and that's an official term, blank be blank. Give me some examples from the video. Yes?
Billion adults can't read around the world.
So you have the right to read, or you have the right to education and literacy, but what was the number?
Like a billion.
Like a billion. Like a lot of adults can't read? Yes?
Many people, including children, are forced into labor, and that violates the right of the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, so that violates your Thomas Jefferson right of pursuit of happiness. But it also, we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and we talk about slavery as this historical institution, this stain on America's history, this stain on the world. And again, there are more slaves today than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And why do we have slaves? Because of your and my ecological footprint. Because I'm such a consumer, there are people working in sweatshops so that I can have this amazing lifestyle that I've grown accustomed to. Now, I don't own them directly, but they live in servitude because of my consumption. Yes? Yeah, so they're not enforced, they're just words on a page because we don't have a UN world police force that goes around and violates the sovereignty of countries, goes into Canada and arrests the government if they're violating our human rights. Yes, sir?
Is slavery, like working in a sweatshop, considered slavery?
They wouldn't use the word slavery because it has such a negative connotation, but it's very parallel. You could argue that slaves in historical arrangements like southern United States, they were paid with food and housing, food and shelter, right? So if you look at a worker in Bangladesh today that's making 10 cents an hour to pay for food and shelter, or if you look at somebody that worked in the southern United States 150 years ago and was given food and shelter, there really is just a semantic difference.
Also said, remember that source that said something about all they need is like for their rights and their good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael Walker, yeah.
Yeah, Michael Walker.
We
Yes.
actually witnessed this in a video when a girl was not allowed to talk about the conditions of one of the sweatshops that she worked in.
Mm-hmm.
And that violates both the freedom of protest and the freedom of speech.
Absolutely. So although we've declared them, doesn't mean we have them. Although we've declared that men and women are equal, I've already given you the very simple example from Saudi Arabia, that men and women are not equal. Now that's Saudi Arabia. It's easy for us in Canada to sit in our ivory tower and say, look at Saudi Arabia, they're bad. How do we know women are not equal in Canada? How do we know, how would you measure the inequality of women in Canada? If you were going to have, as your topic sentence, women are still not equal in Canada, what's your evidence? Yes?
Often it is a really good argument you could use against that is the crime rates. Most crime rates are against women simply because of biological factors, or because a lot of men are ingrained with this idea that they are above women, or even women against other women, believing that a lot of women are, pardon my language, but sluts or whores.
Okay. Yeah, so pardoning your language, getting back to the previous stuff that you shared with us there, definitely we can look at how women are seen in society, right? That they are seen as less than, and because of that, sometimes they're preyed upon. Because if you have two possible marks to rob, maybe you'll rob the woman because you see her as less than. Any other ways that we can measure it? Yes?
So people that have abortion is still shopping on
Okay, being that people are still discussing things like abortion, perhaps, yep. Wage gaps. So if you wanted to measure that women are not equal to men, many people may, in the least controversial one of the ones you guys talked about, they might look at wage gaps. Now, being a teacher, I don't get paid more as a male teacher than a female teacher. We have a grid, we have a union, it's all very pre-programmed, but you guys probably already know this because you're a very plugged in generation, but do you guys know on average what women make compared to men in Canada?
Not much.
So let's just Google it and see. So let's say wage gap Canada. 87%. So that's not bad, but it's not equal. So it's saying that on average, women make 87 cents for every dollar men make. And they're trying to compare apples to apples. So they're not saying like a male doctor makes $1 and a female teacher makes 87 cents. That makes sense because doctors make more than teachers. what they're trying to say is these are two people in the same profession at the same level. The guy's making more. So that's one way to measure inequality on gender today, is the gender gap in a pay scale. And that is highlighted in your textbook. They talk about the gender gap, and they show two different corporate ladders. And the corporate ladder for the woman is restricted, that she can only climb so far because of her gender. That the corporation only wants to promote her so far, because they're going to make arguments like, well, we would invest time into training you, but you're probably going to lose 5, 10, 15 years as you're going to want to go home and be a mom. So we're not going to put the money into training you. We'll put the money into the guy next to you instead. Even though you're probably a better candidate. You're much better at your job, but you're going to go on maternity leave and maybe not come back, and then we lose our investment. This dude's going to be here for the next 20 years. So we still run into a lot of that in the workplace. All right, so let's take a look at this quote. I understand human needs. I grew up where far too many people live day to day without elemental needs like food and shelter. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. We already have, thanks to technology, development skills, the efficiency of our work, enough resources to satisfy all human needs, but we don't have enough resources, and we are unlikely ever to have, to satisfy human greed. So the ideological perspective of that quote is, what is an obstacle to human rights? Selfishness, greed. And that another ideological perspective of the source is that there's a connection between Maslow's hierarchy of needs and human rights. That we should all have those basic physiological needs met for us. We often have people protesting to try to get their needs protected more. Here you have students from Concordia University participating in a walk to help fund some former child soldiers in Uganda. The extremists are afraid of books and pens. The power of education frightens them. They are afraid of women. The power of the voice of women frightens them. Now we have a map of the world, and it shows gender inequality. What are some conclusions you can make based upon that map? What are some observations, some trends? So conclusion might be something like, people who drive Ford cars are typically more likely to like football. That's not what this is showing. Fords and football, that it has nothing to do with this. What is the trend or conclusion that you can make based upon this visual? So we're going to read a graph, and we're going to say, based upon what I see, this is the correlation. So you've helped me tons today, you helped me tons today, you've helped me tons. I'm going to see if someone else can help us out. So what's a correlation we can see? So do you see any trends? Yes, sir.
The poorer a country is, the more likely there is to be gender inequality.
Okay, so often we talk about the developed world and the developing world. The developed world is, by definition, going to be further along the industrial process. They're going to be wealthier. You know, you have North America, you have Europe, you have Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and you can see that these are the areas where women are most equal. And then you have the developing world, countries that are still going through the Industrial Revolution, and within the developing world you have less and least developed countries. And the least developed countries in the world are places like Chad, and Chad's actually, they're not sharing any data with us. They're like, well, we're not going to tell you. or Afghanistan, they're like, you know what? We are one of the worst places here for, it's the darkest red, right? Actually, maybe it's not the darkest red, it's the second darkest red. So when you look at where is it red, where is it darker red, you're absolutely right. It's in the places that are most poor. So with economic prosperity comes more gender equality. That's the summary of that chart. It's an interesting observation.
Would you say that with economic prosperity, more rights come as well?
I would think so, yeah. Here's the cartoon. First thing I want you to do with that cartoon is tell me what right is the context of the cartoon. What is the cartoon about? And I'm going to tell you, it's not about the Second Amendment, you know, the right to bear arms. It's not about religious freedom. What is the right that this cartoon is based on? So it says, we found plenty on this guy. Concealed First Amendment, a suspicious freedom of assembly, a dubious freedom from unreasonable searches, and so on and on. Yes?
The Patriot Act, which I believe was an act enacted to help stop terrorism.
So it's the Patriot Act. The USA Patriot Act is the U.S. response after 9/11. But what rights are being violated? You know, what rights is this a discussion of? Yeah?
Freedom of privacy, freedom of speech.
Anybody know what right in the United States is the right to privacy from government? Which amendment is it? It's not the first. Freedom of speech is first, and that's why it's up there. Freedom of assembly is first, and that's why it's up there. So it's about the First Amendment, the speech, the assembly, but it's also about privacy from government. And this is a specific amendment in the Bill of Rights I want you to know after today's class. So that when we see a source and people's privacy is being violated, you can say, this source is highlighting a violation of the blank amendment, and I want you to know the number of it. So what number in the Bill of Rights is the right to privacy from government? Now, it's just a list of numbers we can guess, right? First Amendment is assembly, Second Amendment is gun. So it's not those. You would think it's third, but it's actually fourth. It's the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy. So I want you to understand that privacy from government is the Fourth Amendment. So yesterday when we were talking about closed caption television and 200 million CCTV cameras watching the Chinese nation, they don't have the Fourth Amendment. They don't have privacy from government. Their government's watching them. They live in a deep state where it's a surveillance nation. The government's watching in an Orwellian way. Yes, sir?
So in China, they have CCTV cameras in people's homes?
Well, I wouldn't say officially, but they would have them sometimes pointed into your homes. But let's be honest, we have cameras in our school. So we watch you here. Yes, sir?
Is it in China, like, some citizens are given a job and some citizens are looking at their own citizens?
Yeah, they definitely pay people to watch people, but we have CSIS doing that in Canada as well. And the United States has the FBI doing that, and Homeland Security.
This time?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay. I feel like the difference between China and Canada and the United States is that here in North America, we have it much less, and we're not literally spying into people's homes. Yes, we have it in schools, but that is a safety precaution to help other students rather than in the interest of the government, who are quickly losing control.
Yeah, I think it's about when, where, and why. I am going to wrap it up there. Sorry. This is going to be the assignment of the day. So we have 40 minutes left. That's half of a regular class. And in the 40 minutes, I need you to do two things for me. But I'm giving you 40 minutes, so I must be expecting more than just a line or two. I want you to choose what you believe to be the most fundamental right. And I need you to describe for me why, if you take away that right, you really toxify our relationship with each other and our relationship with government. Why is it that if you take that right away, we can't have a good life? that this is a threshold right that, and I'm gonna go ahead and say you can't use life, because it's too obvious, the right to life. So aside from the right to life, what is a right that if you take away, we can no longer have a good life? And then the second part of the assignment, I want you to talk about when is it reasonable to limit it. So the first part, you're saying this is why it's critical. You know, we can't allow it to be taken away, because if it gets taken away, our lives become less. Second part of it then says, under these conditions, government can take it away. So I'm giving you 40 minutes because it's not an easy assignment. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves about it, but in the end, I'd like everybody to be able to hand in their own work.
So we have to repeat these out, you say.
Copy that.